Jacob Rivers woke up to the sound of his alarm clock buzzing loudly on the nightstand. It was still dark outside, but he knew the day would soon bring light. He reached over and turned off the alarm, rubbing his eyes as he sat up in bed. Jacob had always been an early riser, a habit born from years of working long hours at the factory. At 32, he was a man who believed in hard work and doing things the right way. Life hadn't always been easy for him, but he prided himself on staying focused and keeping his head down. His wife, Maria, stirred beside him. She rolled over and looked at him with sleepy eyes. "You're up already?" she mumbled softly. "Yeah," Jacob replied, smiling faintly. "Gotta get moving, don't want to be late." Maria nodded and stretched her arms above her head. "I'll make some coffee before I drop you off," she said, sitting up. Her voice carried a warmth that always made Jacob feel grounded. Even on tough days, Maria's presence reminded him why he kept pushing forward. After getting dressed in his usual blue overalls and grabbing a quick breakfast, Jacob hopped into the passenger seat of their old sedan. Maria drove while he scrolled through messages on his phone. Most were harmless updates from coworkers or reminders about shifts at the factory. The drive wasn't long, just 10 minutes, but it gave them time to talk about little things. What they needed from the grocery store, plans for the weekend, how Maria's nursing job was going. When they arrived at the factory gates, Jacob leaned over and kissed Maria on the cheek. "Thanks for the ride," he said. "See you tonight?" She smiled. "Of course, have a good day, okay?" "I will," he promised, stepping out of the car. As Maria drove away, Jacob adjusted the strap of his lunchbox and started walking toward the employee entrance. The air was crisp and the sky was slowly turning from black to gray. Everything seemed normal. The hum of machinery in the distance, the occasional honk of a truck backing up, the chatter of other workers heading inside. But then something changed. Police cruiser pulled up alongside the curb, its tires crunching against the gravel. Jacob glanced at it briefly, thinking nothing of it. Cops patrolled this area often because of the nearby warehouses and factories. But instead of driving past like usual, the car slowed to a stop. Two officers stepped out, one tall and broad-shouldered, the other shorter but equally imposing. They wore uniforms that looked stiff and new, almost too clean for the gritty surroundings. The taller officer approached Jacob first. His nameplate read Doyle, and his face was unreadable behind mirrored sunglasses. "Morning," he said, his tone clipped. "Can I see your ID?" Jacob froze for a moment, surprised by the request. He wasn't doing anything wrong, he was just standing there minding his own business. Still, he didn't argue. That wasn't his style. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out his wallet and handed over his driver's license. "Sure," he said calmly. "Is there a problem?" Officer Doyle studied the card without responding, flipping it over in his hands as if searching for something hidden. Meanwhile, the second officer, whose nameplate said Harris, stood a few feet back, watching silently. The tension in the air grew thicker with each passing second. "I'm just here for work," Jacob added, gesturing toward the factory behind him. "I've got a shift starting soon." Doyle ignored the explanation and asked another question. "What are you carrying in that bag?" he demanded, pointing at Jacob's lunchbox. "It's just my lunch," Jacob replied, frowning now. "Why are you asking me all these questions? I haven't done anything." For a moment, neither officer responded. Then Harris stepped closer, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. "We got a report about someone matching your description acting suspiciously around here," he said. "Blue overalls, tall guy, hanging out near the restricted zone." Jacob blinked, confused. "Restricted zone? I'm not even close to that part of the property. Look, I've worked here for 5 years. Ask anyone. They'll tell you I'm legit." But his words fell on deaf ears. Doyle snapped his fingers at Harris, signaling him to move closer. "Let's check him out," Doyle muttered under his breath. Without waiting for permission, Harris grabbed Jacob's arm and spun him around, forcing his hands behind his back. "Hey," Jacob protested, trying to pull away. "What are you doing? You can't do this." "We can and we are," Doyle shot back, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "You're coming with us." Jacob's heart raced as the cold metal clicked around his wrists. This couldn't be happening, not to him, not here. He called out to the other workers nearby, hoping someone would step in or at least witness what was going on. A few people stopped and stared, but no one intervened. Some shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact altogether. Others whispered, among themselves, shaking their heads. As Doyle shoved Jacob into the back seat of the patrol car, he caught sight of a co-worker named Carl standing near the gate. Their eyes met briefly, and Carl gave a small nod as if promising to remember this moment. Jacob clung to that tiny bit of hope as the door slammed shut and the engine roared to life. The ride to the station was silent except for the occasional crackle of the police radio. Jacob sat hunched over, his mind racing with questions. Why was this happening? What kind of report could they possibly have gotten? And most importantly, how could he prove his innocence when no one seemed willing to listen? By the time they arrived at the precinct, Jacob felt drained. The weight of the situation pressed down on him like a physical force. He thought about Maria and how worried she'd be when she realized he wasn't at work. Would she figure out what happened? Would anyone believe her if she tried to explain? Inside the building, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the walls. Jacob was led to a small room with a table and 2 chairs. The air smelled stale, like it hadn't been cleaned in weeks. Doyle and Harris left him alone for a while, leaving him to sit in silence and stew in his thoughts. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. Every minute felt like an hour. Finally, the door creaked open, and a woman walked in. She introduced herself as Detective Laura Bennett, her voice softer than the others. She placed a notepad on the table and sat down across from him. "I'm sorry about all this," she began, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely sure what all this entailed. "Can you tell me where you were earlier this morning?" Jacob took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "I already told those guys. I was on my way to work. My wife dropped me off at the factory gates and I was walking toward the entrance when they stopped me." "That's it." Laura scribbled something down, her expression unreadable. For the first time since the ordeal began, Jacob allowed himself a sliver of optimism. Maybe this detective would actually listen. Maybe she'd see that he was telling the truth. But deep down he knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Detective Laura Bennett leaned back in her chair, studying Jacob carefully. Her eyes flicked between him and the notes she had jotted down on her notepad. The room was quiet, except for the faint hum of the air conditioner above them. Jacob sat, across from her, his hand still cuffed behind his back, his face a mix of frustration and exhaustion. He tried to stay calm, but the weight of the situation pressed down on him like a heavy blanket. "Let's start from the beginning," Laura said, her voice softer than before. "You mentioned your wife dropped you off at the factory gates. What time was that?" Jacob hesitated, thinking back to earlier that morning. "It was around 6:30, maybe a little after. She can confirm it if you need to check." Laura nodded and wrote something down. "Okay. And what did you do after? She left?" "I walked toward the employee entrance," Jacob replied. "I wasn't doing anything unusual. Just heading to work like I always do." Laura paused, tapping her pen against the edge of the table. "Do you know why Officers Doyle and Harris stopped you? Did they give you a reason?" "They said someone reported seeing a tall black man in blue overalls acting suspiciously near the restricted area," Jacob explained, his voice rising slightly. "But I wasn't anywhere near there. I've worked at that factory for 5 years. I know where the restricted zones are, and I wasn't even close." Laura didn't respond immediately. Instead, she flipped through the file in front of her, scanning the sparse details of the report. There wasn't much there, just a vague tip about suspicious activity involving someone matching Jacob's description. No names, no specifics, nothing concrete. It bothered her. She had seen too many cases like this one, where assumptions took the place of evidence. Before she could say anything else, the door opened, and Officer Doyle stepped inside. His demeanor was brash, his jaw tight as he glanced at Jacob. "We're done here," he announced, ignoring Laura completely. "Take him to holding until we sort this out." Laura frowned, turning to Doyle. "Hold on a second, I'm still speaking with him." Doyle crossed his arms, his tone sharp. "He's already been detained. You don't need to waste your time asking questions. We've got enough to hold him." "That's not how this works," Laura shot back, her voice firm. "We follow procedure. If you have evidence, show me. Otherwise, let me do my job." For a moment, the two officers locked eyes, tension crackling between them. Finally, Doyle muttered something under his breath and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Laura sighed, rubbing her temples. She turned back to Jacob, who watched the exchange with wide eyes. "I'm sorry about that," she said quietly. "This isn't easy for anyone." Jacob nodded, though he didn't feel particularly reassured. "What happens now?" he asked. "We'll keep talking," Laura replied. "I want to understand exactly what happened this morning, but first I'll make sure those cuffs are removed. They shouldn't have kept them on this long." She stood up and left the room, leaving Jacob alone once again. He stared at the wall, trying to process everything. The cuffs were uncomfortable, digging into his wrists, but it wasn't just the physical pain that bothered him. It was the injustice of it all. He hadn't done anything wrong, yet he was being treated like a criminal. A few minutes later, Laura returned with another officer, who unlocked the handcuffs. Jacob flexed his fingers, relief washing over him as the pressure eased. Laura gestured for him to sit back down, and he did, leaning forward slightly as if ready to defend himself. "Tell me more about your routine," Laura said. "Is there anyone who saw you this morning besides your wife?" Jacob thought for a moment. "Yeah, there's Carl. He works with me at the factory. He was standing near the gate when they put me in the car. I think he saw everything." Laura made a note of the name. "Good. That helps. Is there anyone else?" "There might be others," Jacob said. "People were walking by when it happened. Some of them stopped to watch. I don't know their names, but they could tell you I wasn't doing anything strange." Laura nodded, jotting down more details. She seemed genuinely interested in piecing together the truth, which gave Jacob a small sense of hope. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that the odds were stacked against him. The way Doyle and Harris had acted earlier left little doubt in his mind. They weren't looking for answers. They had already decided he was guilty. As the interrogation continued, Laura asked routine questions about Jacob's background, his employment history, and whether he had any connection to recent crimes in the area. Jacob answered honestly, explaining that he had no involvement whatsoever. He described his daily life, emphasizing how ordinary it was. He lived in a modest apartment with Maria, worked hard at the factory, and spent his free time relaxing at home or visiting family. Nothing about his story suggested he was capable of wrongdoing. Despite his cooperation, Jacob couldn't help but notice the skepticism in Laura's eyes. It wasn't directed at him personally, but rather at the system she was part of, a system that often failed people like him. He wondered if she truly believed he was innocent, or if she was simply going through the motions, following protocol without expecting to uncover the truth. After nearly an hour of questioning, Laura closed her notebook and stood up. "That's all for now," she said. "I'll look into this further and see what I can find. In the meantime, you'll need to stay here while we figure things out." Jacob's heart sank. "How long will that take?" he asked, his voice tinged with desperation. "I can't say for sure," Laura admitted, "but I'll do what I can to move things along." With that, she left the room, leaving Jacob alone once again. The silence was deafening, pressing down on him like a weight. He thought about Maria and how worried she must be by now. She would have realized something was wrong when he didn't show up for his shift. Would she try to call the factory? Or would she go straight to the police station? Hours passed, though it felt like days. Jacob sat in the cold, sterile room, replaying the events of the morning in his mind. Every detail stood out sharply: the sound of Doyle's voice, the way Harris grabbed his arm, the look of confusion on Carl's face. He replayed it over and over, searching for something he might have missed, some clue that could explain why this had happened. Finally, the door opened again. This time, it wasn't Laura who entered, but a different officer, a younger man with a kinder expression. "You've got visitors," he said simply, stepping aside to let someone in. Jacob's heart leapt when he saw Maria walk in, followed closely by Alex Carter, their neighbor. Maria rushed to his side, tears streaming down her face. "Oh my God, Jacob," she cried, throwing her arms around him. "Are you okay? What's going on?" "I'm fine," Jacob assured her, hugging her tightly. "They won't tell me anything. They just keep asking questions." Maria pulled back, wiping her eyes. "We came as soon as we found out. The factory manager called me. He said you never showed up for work. I didn't know what to think." Alex stepped forward, placing a reassuring hand on Jacob's shoulder. "Don't worry, man. We're going to get this sorted out. I brought Daniel Myers with me. He's waiting outside." Jacob's eyes widened. "Daniel Myers, the lawyer?" Alex nodded. "Yeah, he specializes in cases like this. He'll help us fight back." Relief washed over Jacob, though it was tempered by anger. He shouldn't need a lawyer to prove his innocence. He should be able to walk into work without fear of being harassed or detained. But he knew the reality was different, especially for someone like him. Having Daniel on their side gave him hope, but it also highlighted just how broken the system was. Before they could say anything else, the officer cleared his throat. "You've got 5 minutes," he reminded them. Maria squeezed Jacob's hand. "We're not leaving until you're out of here," she promised. "Stay strong, okay?" Jacob nodded, feeling a surge of gratitude. For the first time since the ordeal began, he felt less alone. Whatever happened next, he knew he had people fighting for him, and that made all the difference. Maria and Alex left the room, their faces filled with determination. Jacob watched them go, feeling a mix of emotions: gratitude for their support, frustration over his situation, and a flicker of hope that someone might finally listen. The door closed behind them, leaving him alone once again. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the cracked ceiling tiles above him. His mind raced with questions. Would Daniel Myers be able to help? Could they prove he was innocent when there was no real evidence against him? A few minutes later, the door opened again. This time, it was Detective Laura Bennett who entered. She carried a folder under one arm and looked more serious than before. Jacob sat up straighter, trying to gauge her expression. Was she on his side, or was she just another part of the system working against him? "I spoke with your wife and neighbor," Laura began, sitting down across from him. "They seem very concerned about you." "They're good people," Jacob said simply. "They know I didn't do anything wrong." Laura nodded, opening the folder. Inside were copies of the report that had led to his detention, a vague tip phoned in by an anonymous caller. The description matched countless workers in the industrial area: tall, black, wearing blue overalls. There was nothing specific, nothing concrete. No mention of suspicious behavior beyond the word loitering. It was flimsy at best. "This is the report we acted on," Laura said, sliding the paper toward Jacob. "Does any of this sound familiar to you?" Jacob glanced at it quickly, shaking his head. "No, none of this makes sense. I wasn't loitering, I was walking to work. And even if I was standing still for a minute, that's not a crime." "You're right," Laura admitted. "But sometimes these tips come in and we have to investigate. Unfortunately, not all investigations are handled fairly." Her words surprised Jacob. He hadn't expected her to acknowledge the flaws in the process so openly. For a moment he wondered if she truly wanted to help. But then he remembered how Doyle and Harris had treated him earlier. Their dismissive attitudes, their refusal to listen. Could one detective make a difference? "What happens now?" Jacob asked cautiously. "We'll keep digging," Laura replied. "I'm going to review surveillance footage from the factory gates and talk to your co-workers. If anyone saw you this morning, their statements could clear your name." Jacob nodded, though he didn't feel entirely reassured. Surveillance cameras were everywhere, but would they show enough to prove his innocence? Or would they be ignored like everything else? Outside the interrogation room, Maria and Alex met with Daniel Myers in the waiting area. Daniel was a middle-aged man with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor. He wore a dark suit and carried a leather briefcase, exuding confidence without being intimidating. Maria immediately felt a sense of relief seeing him there. "Thank you for coming," she said, shaking his hand firmly. "Of course," Daniel replied. "Tell me everything that's happened so far." Alex and Maria took turns explaining what they knew, from the arrest at the factory gates to Jacob's current detention. Daniel listened intently, jotting down notes as they spoke. When they finished, he leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against his chin. "This sounds like a textbook case of racial profiling," he said bluntly. "Based on what you've told me, there's no legitimate reason for them to hold Jacob. We can file a formal complaint and request his immediate release." Maria's eyes lit up with hope. "Can we do that now?" "Yes," Daniel said. "But first I need to speak with Jacob directly. Let's see what information he has and whether they've accused him of anything specific yet." With that, Daniel approached the front desk and requested access to Jacob. After some back and forth with the officers on duty, he was allowed into the interrogation room. When Jacob saw Daniel walk in, he felt a surge of relief. Having legal representation made him feel less powerless. "Mr. Rivers," Daniel greeted him warmly, extending his hand. "I'm Daniel Myers. Your wife and neighbor brought me in to assist." "Thank you for coming," Jacob said, shaking his hand. "I don't know why this is happening to me." Daniel sat down across from him, pulling out a notepad. "Let's start from the beginning. Tell me exactly what happened this morning." Jacob recounted the events step by step, from being stopped by officers Doyle and Harris to his time in the interrogation room with Detective Bennett. Daniel listened carefully, asking clarifying questions along the way. By the end of Jacob's explanation, Daniel had a clear picture of the situation. "Okay," Daniel said, closing his notepad. "Here's what we're going to do. First, I'll file a formal request for your release based on lack of probable cause. Second, I'll gather affidavits from witnesses who saw you this morning, starting with Carl and anyone else who might have been nearby. Third, we'll document every interaction you've had with the officers, including any inappropriate behavior." Jacob nodded, feeling a renewed sense of hope. "Do you think it'll work?" "It has to," Daniel replied firmly. "The law is on our side here. They can't detain you indefinitely without evidence. And if they try to push back, we'll escalate the matter publicly. These kinds of cases often gain attention, which puts pressure on the department to act responsibly." As Daniel prepared to leave the room, he turned back to Jacob. "Stay strong. This isn't going to be easy, but we're going to fight for justice." Meanwhile, Detective Laura Bennett continued her investigation. She reviewed the surveillance footage from the factory gates, searching for any sign of Jacob. Sure enough, the cameras captured him walking toward the entrance shortly after his wife dropped him off. There was nothing unusual about his movements. He wasn't lurking, loitering, or acting suspiciously in any way. Laura also spoke with Carl, the co-worker Jacob had mentioned. Carl confirmed that he had seen Jacob heading to work and witnessed the altercation with the officers. "He wasn't doing anything wrong," Carl insisted. "They just pulled up and started questioning him. It didn't make sense." With each piece of evidence pointing toward Jacob's innocence, Laura grew increasingly uneasy. She couldn't ignore the pattern she'd noticed during her career, cases where black individuals were targeted unfairly, often based on vague reports or assumptions. This was shaping up to be another example of systemic bias within law enforcement. She decided to confront officers Doyle and Harris directly. Finding them in the break room, she closed the door behind her and crossed her arms. "What's going on with this Rivers case?" she demanded. Doyle shrugged nonchalantly. "Just following up on a tip. What's the big deal?" "The big deal," Laura snapped, "is that there's no evidence to justify holding him. The surveillance footage shows he was doing exactly what he claimed, walking to work. His co-workers confirm it too. So why are we wasting resources detaining him?" Harris shifted uncomfortably. "Look, we're just doing our job. Someone called it in. We responded." "And maybe you responded too aggressively," Laura shot back. This isn't the first time something like this has happened. You need to think about how your actions reflect on the department and on yourselves. Doyle rolled his eyes. Whatever. If you've got a problem, take it up with internal affairs. Laura clenched her fists, resisting the urge to argue further. Instead, she walked out of the room, determined to fix the mess they'd created. She returned to her desk and drafted a memo recommending Jacob's immediate release due to insufficient evidence. Then she forwarded it to her supervisor, hoping it would expedite the process. By late afternoon, Daniel Myers had filed the necessary paperwork and gathered initial witness statements. Armed with this information, he approached the precinct's commanding officer, demanding Jacob's release. The officer hesitated at first, citing procedural delays, but Daniel refused to back down. "If you don't release Mr. Rivers immediately," Daniel warned, "we'll go public with this case. Trust me, you don't want that kind of attention." Faced with mounting pressure, the officer relented. Within an hour, Jacob was freed from custody, stepping out into the cool evening air. Maria rushed to him, hugging him tightly as tears streamed down her face. Alex stood nearby, clapping Jacob on the shoulder. "You did great," Daniel said, smiling. "But this isn't over. We're going to hold them accountable for what happened today." Jacob nodded, feeling a mix of emotions: relief, anger, and determination. He didn't want anyone else to experience what he had endured. As they walked away from the precinct together, he vowed to fight for change, no matter how long it took. Jacob stepped out of the precinct, the cool evening air brushing against his face. He took a deep breath, savoring the feeling of freedom after hours of being trapped inside the cold, sterile walls. Maria stood beside him, her arms wrapped tightly around his waist as if afraid he might disappear again. Alex and Daniel Myers flanked them, their presence offering both comfort and reassurance. Despite the relief washing over him, Jacob couldn't shake the anger simmering beneath the surface. The memory of Doyle and Harris's accusatory stares lingered in his mind, a reminder of how easily he had been targeted. "Let's get you home," Maria said softly, pulling back to look at him. Her eyes were red from crying, but there was strength in her voice. "You need to rest." Jacob nodded, though resting felt impossible. His mind raced with thoughts of what had happened and what came next. He glanced at Daniel, who seemed to sense his unease. "We'll talk more tomorrow," Daniel assured him. "For now, focus on getting some sleep. You've been through a lot today." Alex patted Jacob on the shoulder. "Call me if you need anything. We're all here for you." With that, Alex and Daniel headed to their cars, leaving Jacob and Maria alone. They walked to the sedan in silence, the weight of the day hanging heavy between them. As they drove home, Maria reached over and held Jacob's hand, squeezing it gently. He appreciated the gesture but found himself staring out the window, lost in thought. The next morning, Jacob woke up early, unable to sleep past sunrise. He sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee while Maria moved quietly around the apartment, tidying up. She could tell something was bothering him, but she didn't press. Instead, she poured herself a cup of coffee and joined him at the table. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. Jacob sighed, setting his mug down. "I keep replaying everything in my head. Why did this happen to me? What if someone else gets treated like this tomorrow?" Maria reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "That's why we have to fight back, not just for you, for everyone who's ever been treated unfairly because of their skin color." Jacob nodded slowly. He knew she was right, but the road ahead felt daunting. Fighting against the system wasn't easy, especially when the odds were stacked against you. Still, he couldn't ignore the responsibility he felt to stand up for what was right. Later that day, Daniel arrived, at their apartment carrying a stack of documents. He greeted Jacob and Maria warmly before spreading the papers across the dining table. "Here's where we stand," he began, pointing to a timeline he had created. "We've filed a formal complaint against officers Doyle and Harris for misconduct. In addition, I'm preparing a lawsuit against the department for racial profiling and unlawful detention." Jacob raised an eyebrow. "Will that actually work? Aren't lawsuits like this hard to win?" "They can be," Daniel admitted. But we have strong evidence on our side. The surveillance footage, witness statements, and Detective Bennett's report all support your innocence. Plus, public opinion matters. If we bring enough attention to this case, it puts pressure on the department to take action." Maria leaned forward, her expression determined. "What do you need from us?" "For now, just stay patient," Daniel replied. "This process takes time. But I'll also need you to reach out to anyone else who might have witnessed what happened." "Every statement helps strengthen our case," Jacob nodded. "I'll call Carl and see if he knows anyone else who saw me that morning." "Good idea," Daniel said. "And don't worry, I'll handle the legal side of things. Your job is to focus on staying strong." After Daniel left, Jacob picked up the phone and dialed Carl's number. Carl answered almost immediately, his voice filled with concern. "Hey Jacob, how are you holding up?" "I'm okay," Jacob replied. "Listen, I need your help. Do you remember anyone else who was near the factory gates when those cops stopped me?" Carl paused, thinking back to that morning. "Yeah, there were a few people. Marcus was standing close by, and so was Lisa. I think they saw everything." "That's great," Jacob said, relief washing over him. "Can you give me their numbers? I'd really appreciate it." "Of course," Carl replied. "Anything you need." Over the next few days, Jacob reached out to Marcus, Lisa, and several other co-workers who had been present during the incident. Each one agreed to provide a statement supporting his account of events. Their willingness to help gave Jacob a renewed sense of hope. It reminded him that he wasn't alone, that there were good people willing to stand up for what was right. Meanwhile, Detective Laura Bennett continued her efforts to expose the flaws in the department's handling of Jacob's case. She dug deeper into the records, uncovering a troubling pattern of similar incidents involving Black individuals detained without sufficient cause. Some cases dated back years, buried under layers of bureaucracy and indifference. Laura compiled her findings into a detailed report, which she submitted to Internal Affairs. Her actions did not go unnoticed. Officers Doyle and Harris grew increasingly hostile toward her, accusing her of undermining their authority. One afternoon, Doyle cornered her in the hallway outside the break room. "What's your problem, Bennett?" he demanded, his voice low but sharp. "Why are you sticking your nose where it doesn't belong?" Laura met his glare with steely resolve. "My job is to ensure justice is served, not to cover up mistakes. If you two acted appropriately, you wouldn't have anything to worry about." Doyle clenched his fist but said nothing. He stormed off, leaving Laura standing alone in the hallway. Though she felt a pang of fear, she refused to back down. She knew the risks of challenging the status quo, but she also knew it was the right thing to do. As the weeks passed, Jacob's case began gaining traction in the media. Local news outlets picked up the story, highlighting the systemic issues within law enforcement that allowed such injustices to occur. Protesters gathered outside, the precinct holding signs that read, "Justice for Jacob Rivers" and "End Racial Profiling Now." The community rallied around Jacob, offering support and solidarity. One evening, Jacob and Maria attended a town hall meeting organized by civil rights activists. The room buzzed with energy as speakers shared personal stories of discrimination and police misconduct. When it was Jacob's turn to speak, he stood nervously at the podium, gripping the sides tightly. "I didn't ask for this," he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "All I wanted was to go to work and live my life. But what happened to me isn't unique. It happens every day to people who look like me. That needs to change." The crowd erupted in applause, cheering him on. For the first time since the ordeal began, Jacob felt a glimmer of optimism. Change wouldn't come overnight, but he believed it was possible, if enough people kept fighting for it. Back at home, Maria hugged him tightly. "You did amazing," she said, pride shining in her eyes. "I just told the truth," Jacob replied. "That's all any of us can do." Though the battle was far from over, Jacob knew he was on the right path. With Maria by his side, friends and neighbors supporting him, and advocates like Daniel and Laura pushing for accountability, he felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The days that followed the town hall meeting were a whirlwind of activity for Jacob and Maria. News of Jacob's case spread quickly, drawing attention not only from local media, but also from national outlets. Reporters called constantly, asking for interviews and updates. Some neighbors stopped by to offer words of encouragement, while others left notes of support on their doorstep. It was overwhelming at times, but Jacob tried to stay focused on the bigger picture. He reminded himself that this wasn't just about him. It was about shining a light on the systemic issues that affected countless others. Daniel Myers worked tirelessly behind the scenes, preparing the lawsuit against the police department. He filed motions, gathered affidavits, and coordinated with civil rights organizations to amplify the message. The evidence was mounting, and public pressure was growing. Protesters continued to gather outside the precinct, holding signs and chanting slogans like "No justice, no peace," and "Accountability now." Even some officers within the department began speaking out, anonymously sharing their concerns about discriminatory practices. Despite the progress, tensions inside the precinct reached a boiling point. Officers Doyle and Harris grew increasingly defensive, lashing out at anyone who questioned their actions. One afternoon, Detective Laura Bennett walked into the break room to find them arguing loudly with another officer, a young man named Ryan who had recently joined the force. "You think you're better than us?" Doyle spat, his face red with anger. "You've been here 5 minutes and already you're siding with them?" Ryan stood his ground, though his voice trembled slightly. "I'm not taking sides. I'm just saying we should admit when we make mistakes. Holding innocent people isn't going to solve anything." Harris stepped closer, jabbing a finger in Ryan's direction. "If you don't like how things are done around here, maybe you should find another job." Laura cleared her throat, stepping between them. "Enough," she said firmly. "This isn't helping anyone. We need to focus on fixing the problem, not tearing each other apart." Doyle glared at her. "Stay out of this, Bennett. You've caused enough trouble already." Laura didn't back down. "If you two keep acting like this, you'll only dig yourselves deeper. Internal Affairs is already investigating. Cooperating might be your best chance to salvage your careers." Her words seemed to hit home, at least temporarily. Doyle and Harris exchanged a glance before storming out of the room, leaving Laura and Ryan alone. Ryan let out a shaky breath, running a hand through his hair. "Thanks for stepping in," he said quietly. Laura nodded. "Don't let them intimidate you. Doing the right thing isn't always easy, but it's worth it." Meanwhile, Jacob and Maria attended meetings with community leaders and activists to discuss next steps. They spoke at rallies, shared their story on podcasts, and even appeared on a local news program. Each appearance brought new challenges, facing hostile callers during live broadcasts or reading hateful comments online. But Jacob refused to let negativity deter him. He knew there would always be resistance to change, but he also knew that staying silent wasn't an option. One evening, after a particularly draining day of interviews, Jacob sat on the couch with Maria staring at the blank TV screen. "Sometimes I wonder if it's worth it," he admitted, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "All this fighting, will it really make a difference?" Maria turned to him, her expression soft but firm. "It has to. Think about everyone who's watching you, people who feel like they don't have a voice. You're giving them hope. That matters." Jacob sighed, leaning back against the cushions. "I just wish it didn't feel so hard." "It's supposed to be hard," Maria replied. "If it were easy, everyone would do it. But you're stronger than you think, Jacob. Stronger than all of this." Her words stayed with him long after they went to bed. Though the road ahead was uncertain, Jacob clung to the belief that their efforts could lead to real change. He thought about the people he'd met along the way, the co-workers who spoke up, the strangers who offered kind words, the activists who dedicated their lives to fighting injustice. Together, they formed a network of resilience and determination. As the weeks turned into months, the legal battle intensified. Daniel Myers presented the lawsuit in court, arguing that Jacob's detention was a clear example of racial profiling and abuse of power. The courtroom was packed with supporters, many of whom wore buttons that read, "Justice for Jacob." On the stand, Jacob recounted the events of that morning, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. He described how Officers Doyle and Harris had treated him, how they ignored his protests and violated his rights. When asked why he believed he had been targeted, he hesitated briefly before answering. "I think it's because of how I look," he said simply. "Because I'm black. If I were someone else, I don't think any of this would have happened." His honesty resonated with those in attendance, drawing murmurs of agreement from the crowd. Officers Doyle and Harris testified as well, attempting to justify their actions by citing the anonymous tip and claiming they were following standard procedure. But under cross-examination, their explanations fell apart. Daniel skillfully dismantled their arguments, pointing out inconsistencies and highlighting the lack of concrete evidence. Detective Laura Bennett also took the stand, testifying about the flaws she had uncovered in the department's handling of similar cases. Her testimony carried significant weight, as she provided documented examples of racial bias and misconduct. She acknowledged the challenges of reforming a deeply entrenched system, but emphasized the importance of accountability. "We can't move forward unless we confront these issues head-on," she said during her closing statement. "Ignoring them only perpetuates the cycle of injustice." The trial lasted several days, culminating in a verdict that sent shockwaves through the community. The judge ruled in Jacob's favor, ordering the police department to pay damages for wrongful detention and mandating sweeping reforms to address systemic bias. While the financial compensation was meaningful, it was the call for change that truly mattered. The ruling set a precedent, signaling that such behavior would no longer be tolerated. News of the verdict spread rapidly, sparking celebrations across the city. Protesters cheered outside the courthouse, waving flags and chanting victory songs. Inside, Jacob hugged Maria tightly, tears streaming down both their faces. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to feel a sense of closure. "This is just the beginning," Daniel said, smiling as he shook Jacob's hand. "There's still work to be done, but today proves that change is possible." Jacob nodded, looking around at the sea of supportive faces. He felt grateful, not just for the outcome of the case, but for the unity it had inspired. Strangers had become allies, and allies had become family. Together, they had shown that standing up for justice was never a solitary act. That night, Jacob and Maria returned home to find their apartment decorated with balloons and streamers. Alex and a few close friends had organized a small celebration, complete with food and music. As they laughed and talked, Jacob realized something important. The fight hadn't drained him. It had strengthened him. He was surrounded by love and support, and he knew that together, they could continue pushing for a better future. Before going to bed, Jacob stood by the window, gazing at the stars. The scars of the past few months wouldn't fade easily, but neither would the lessons he had learned. He thought about all the people counting on him to keep fighting, and he made a silent promise to himself. No matter how difficult the journey became, he would never stop striving for justice. The weeks following the verdict brought a mix of relief and reflection for Jacob. The court's decision had been a victory, but it wasn't the end of the road. It was more like a stepping stone. Life slowly returned to some semblance of normalcy. Though things were different now, Jacob couldn't walk into the factory or drive through town without someone recognizing him. Some people smiled and nodded in solidarity. Others avoided eye contact altogether, perhaps out of guilt or discomfort. It was strange being known as the guy who stood up to the cops, but Jacob tried not to let it weigh on him too much. He reminded himself that his fight wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about justice. Maria noticed subtle changes in Jacob's demeanor. He seemed quieter at times, lost in thought, but he also carried a newfound sense of purpose. They spent evenings talking about their hopes for the future, how they could use this moment to create lasting change. Jacob wanted to help others avoid the pain he had endured, whether by mentoring young people in the community or working with organizations focused on police reform. Maria supported him wholeheartedly, encouraging him to take small steps rather than rushing into anything. One day, while Jacob was clocking in at the factory, Carl approached him with an idea. "Hey, Jake," he said, his tone serious but friendly. "I've been thinking, what if we started something here? Like a group where workers can share experiences and support each other?" Jacob raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you mean?" "I mean, look at what happened to you," Carl explained. "It shouldn't have gone down like that, and it probably wouldn't have if more people spoke up sooner. We could start holding meetings, just casual conversations to talk about stuff like that. Maybe even bring in speakers or workshops." Jacob nodded slowly, considering the idea. "That sounds good. Let's run it by management and see what they say." To their surprise, the factory manager agreed to let them use a conference room once a month for meetings. Word spread quickly among the workers, and soon the group grew beyond what Jacob and Carl had imagined. People from all departments showed up, not just to discuss issues of racial profiling, but also workplace safety, fair wages, and mental health. For many, it became a safe space to voice concerns they had long kept bottled up. Detective Laura Bennett continued her efforts to push for reform within the police department. Her report on systemic bias sparked discussions at higher levels, leading to mandatory training sessions on implicit bias and accountability. Though progress was slow, Laura remained hopeful. She knew real change took time, especially in institutions resistant to scrutiny. Still, she felt proud of the work she had done, and grateful for individuals like Jacob who had inspired her to speak out. Officers Doyle and Harris faced disciplinary action as a result of the lawsuit. Both were suspended without pay and required to undergo additional training before returning to duty. While some colleagues defended them, claiming they were simply doing their jobs, others acknowledged the need for greater oversight. Internal Affairs launched a broader investigation into past cases involving allegations of misconduct, ensuring no stone was left unturned. Laura found herself mentoring younger officers like Ryan, who sought guidance on navigating the complexities of the job. "How do you stay strong when everyone seems against you?" Ryan asked one afternoon during a coffee break. "You find your allies," Laura replied, "and you remind yourself why you joined in the first place. Protecting people. That's what policing is supposed to be about. Not power, not fear, service." Ryan nodded, absorbing her words. "Thanks, I needed to hear that." Daniel Myers stayed involved in Jacob's life, checking in regularly to see how he was adjusting. He encouraged Jacob to consider speaking engagements or writing about his experience, knowing it could inspire others facing similar struggles. At first, Jacob hesitated. He didn't see himself as a writer or public speaker, but eventually, he agreed to collaborate on a short essay for a local magazine. Titled "Standing Up When You're Knocked Down," the piece resonated deeply with readers, earning praise for its honesty and vulnerability. "People connect with your story because it's relatable," Daniel told Jacob after the article was published. "You're showing them that they're not alone." Jacob shrugged modestly. "I'm just telling the truth. If it helps someone else, then it's worth it." Maria beamed with pride every time someone mentioned the article. "You're making a difference, Jacob," she said one evening over dinner. "Even if you don't always see it, you are." As months passed, Jacob and Maria began planning for the future. They saved money, explored new hobbies, and dreamed of starting a family. Jacob returned to his routine at the factory, though he now balanced work with his growing responsibilities as an advocate. He attended panel discussions, met with lawmakers, and collaborated with activists to draft policies aimed at reducing racial profiling. Each step reinforced his belief that change was possible, even if it came one small victory at a time. One evening, as winter settled over the city, Jacob stood outside the apartment building watching snowflakes drift lazily to the ground. Maria joined him, wrapping a scarf around his neck. "Cold enough for you?" she teased, nudging him gently. He chuckled, pulling her close. "Not when I've got you to keep me warm." They stood there silently for a while, enjoying the quiet beauty of the night. Jacob thought about everything they had been through, the injustice, the fear, the anger, and how far they had come. There were still challenges ahead, of course, but he felt ready to face them. Together they had built something stronger than any obstacle. resilience. "I love you," Maria whispered, resting her head on his shoulder. "I love you too," Jacob replied, kissing the top of her head. More than ever. In that moment, surrounded by the peaceful stillness of the season, Jacob allowed himself to feel hopeful. The scars of the past would always be part of him, but so would the lessons he had learned. He had discovered strength he didn't know he possessed, forged bonds with people who shared his vision, and ignited a spark of change that refused to. Hey, life wasn't perfect, far from it, but Jacob believed in the power of persistence. One person could make a difference, and together a community could move mountains. As he walked back inside with Maria, hand in hand, he reminded himself of the promise he had made under the stars. No matter how hard the journey became, he would never stop striving for justice. And with Maria by his side, he knew he could accomplish anything,